The coordination of efforts between Starmer and Macron ought to be inevitable, but it's not going to be. Now we've got newspaper reports saying that they're going to try and pool resources and they're going to try and work together. Of course they are, or they should, to present a united front against Putin's regime. Their message is unequivocal. Under Putin's leadership, and while Russia continues to act as an aggressor in Ukraine, and this needs to be communicated to Trump, there can be no pathway for Russia to join elite international bodies like the G7. Instead, we see a clear signal that the current global order must remain anchored in firm principles and accountability if it's to have any credibility. We can't have somebody like Trump saying, oh, yeah, look, give it a year or so and everything will be back to normal. It can't be, not under the same leadership. At the heart of Starmer and Macron's approach to Trump, I think needs to be a commitment to the rules-based order, which I think is there. And both leaders insist that any discussion about Russia's potential reintegration into the G7 or any similar arrangement is premature and indeed morally untenable as long as illegal military actions continue, or as long as it profits by illegal military actions. The United Kingdom stance is direct. We can't countenance Russia joining the G7 while it's still got illegal forces in Ukraine. Such language is not merely a rhetorical flourish. It reflects deep-seated principles that the legitimacy of global institutions depends on adherence to international law and respect for national sovereignty. I would go further. I would say that it can't possibly join the G7 again while it's trying to retain while it's trying to retain land in another country. The message, if it is united, is strategic. By coordinating their positions, Starmer and Macron can shape discussions with influential figures like Trump or others, ensuring that any resolution to the conflict must centre on Ukrainian sovereignty and security. It's a stance that emphasises unity among Western allies and the importance of holding aggressors to accountable, whether they be Putin or Lavrov at the moment is in Turkey, pounding the podium on his rostrum, and again trying to insist on a narrative where Russia is the victim. It simply is not. It's simply not true. And even if we give that the time of day, we are indulging a deceit which should not be indulged. By all means, forgive. By all means, start again. But we can't indulge in this deceit that condones aggression, individually or as a group. Simultaneously, there's also a possibility that we may be wrong, and I've looked at the stuff being presented by various people across the internet. It doesn't seem to me that the position that Russia is an aggressor is wrong. It doesn't seem to me that the facts can be interpreted in any other way, save that Russia invaded its neighbour. And the new sanctions that have been unveiled, the package that targets 107 entities linked to Moscow's military supply chain. These measures are meticulously designed to restrict access to funding, advanced technology and critical logistical support. And the sanctions extend beyond traditional targets. They encompass components of Russia's shadow fleet with an additional 40 vessels carrying Russian oil now designated, as well as senior officials and even entities in third countries supplying dual-use goods. This economic pressure is a crucial element of the broader strategy, and by hitting Moscow's military infrastructure, these sanctions aim to curtail the Kremlin's ability to sustain its aggressive posture. They're a concrete expression of the resolve to isolate Russia economically and politically until it adheres to international norms. Moreover, such measures serve as a warning. When a regime funds a war machine through illicit channels and aggressive tactics, the international community will respond with coordinated, decisive action. I am not a fan of sanctions at all, but I think once they have been invoked, they probably need to be carried through with a sort of universality. There's no point in pussyfooting about this. It's tempting because sanctions. The problem is sanctions become a sort of a sort of emblem for the sanctioning state. Oh, look, we did sanctions. We're better than everybody else. That's not the issue. Unless everybody's doing sanctions, they don't work. So it has to be coordinated. I don't think it's a good tool, but it's a tool that we have embraced, and so it should be done as well as it can be. It's tempting in theory to argue that a new leadership or a radical change in policy might pave the way for Russia's reintegration into the international community. And that's something, that reintegration is something I think every sane person should want. But the reality is far more complex. That the notion that a regime can be rewarded for its aggression, a thug in blunt terms, could eventually be welcomed back to sit at the table into institutions like the G7 sends a dangerous message. It risks normalizing behavior that subverts international law, that subverts basic civility, subverts normal understanding of morality, undermines the very fabric of global order. To reintroduce a state with such a history into elite circles effectively endorses a Wild West mentality in government, in global government. And where the absence of accountability is then demonstrated to pave the way for impunity. This is not a path that any nation should accept if we wish to preserve the principles of democracy, sovereignty, and human rights. And the message, therefore, needs to be clear. Rewards for nations are reserved for those who uphold the rules of international conduct, not for those who violate them with force and coercion. And the significance of this united front extends beyond the immediate conflict in Ukraine. It's a statement about the future of international politics. And over 7 decades, the post-war consensus, built on a delicate balance of power, economic interdependence, and mutual accountability, has provided a framework for global stability. Yes, nations have not acted as well as they could have done, and there is much failing. But recent events have exposed such serious fractures in this order that they need to have. We need to do serious serious effort to revise what's going on. Hello. Aye. On the one hand, on the one hand, we have voices like that of Donald Trump suggesting that the reintegration of Russia might be revisited once the conflict ends. On the other, we have leaders like Starmer and Macron asserting that any lasting settlement must involve a genuine shift in behaviour from the Russian regime, one that's recognised not only by words but by actions consistent with international law. And the insistence that Ukraine's sovereignty remains paramount underlines the fact that any negotiation with Russia cannot come at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty, security, and self-determination. This divide among Western leaders highlights a deeper debate. Should peace negotiations allow for the sidelining of Ukraine, or must Ukraine remain at the heart of any dialogue? The answer, as articulated by Starmer and Macron, is unequivocal. True and lasting peace cannot be achieved without the full participation and security guarantees for Ukraine. There is, of course, an inherent challenge in maintaining this united front. Diplomatic negotiations are rarely straightforward, and the international arena is replete with competing interests and interpretations of what constitutes a just resolution. In the current context, the UK, the US, and the EU are wrestling with their own internal pressures and differing perspectives on how best to confront Russian aggression while paving the way for a future peace, which is in everybody's interest. For instance, while some voices suggest that readmitting Russia into the G7 might be a realistic eventuality once a new, more responsible leadership emerges, such discussions remain speculative at best and touch on or imply a desire for regime change, which shouldn't be something that one nation demands of another. People like me can demand it, of course. The reality on the ground, characterized by ongoing military operations and widespread violations of international norms, means that for now, Russia should remain isolated from the institutions that represent the pinnacle of international cooperation and economic development. They should be isolated. Furthermore, the complexity of global diplomacy today is amplified by the need to balance economic interests with security imperatives. The sanctions, while aimed at constraining Moscow, also risk unintended consequence on global markets, especially in energy, and navigating these waters requires not only economic acumen, but also a steadfast commitment to principles that must guide international relations in the long term. We need to bring the sanctions to an end as soon as possible. But that doesn't mean that we should be inviting Russia under Putin back to the G7. The coordinated stance of Macron and Starmer is a clear declaration. The reintegration of Russia into the G7 or any similar assembly cannot be contemplated as long as the regime continues to violate or profit from a violation of international norms and to undermine the sovereignty of its neighbours, particularly when that sovereignty was guaranteed by international treaty. The aggressive policies pursued by Putin's government have set a precedent that, if rewarded, could transform the New World Order into something very much like the Wild West, where power is validated by force rather than by adherence to universal principles. This moment, then, I think is crucial. It challenges us to consider not just how to end a specific conflict, but how to uphold a system where justice, accountability, and the rule of law prevail, how to end a conflict, and how to begin a peace. The sanctions, the diplomatic dialogues, the united front presented by leaders like Starmer and Macron are not mere tactical manoeuvres. They are the foundation for a future in which international relations are conducted not on the basis of might alone, but on a shared commitment to a fair and orderly world. So, reflecting on these developments, I think we need to be mindful as a community that true peace and stability can only be achieved when the values of democracy and international law are rigorously defended. Any attempt to reward aggression would not only betray the victims of current conflicts, but also erode the very principles that have sustained global order for decades.